The fantasy playoffs are here, and hopefully you're a contender and not a pretender that just barely slipped into the playoffs. But for a few of these defenses, they might be pretenders, because when you take a look at their body of work over the entire season, it doesn't look like they've played very well against a certain position. But over the last several weeks, they've been way better. So have they actually gotten better against that position, or have they just been providing us a myth over the last few weeks? And there are some studs and some starters that we have going up against these defenses in the fantasy playoffs, and we need to know what we should be expecting. Let's start with the Chicago Bears and what they have been doing against opposing quarterbacks this season. So far this year, they have ranked 9th against opposing quarterbacks in terms of the most fantasy points allowed to the position. For all of the ranks in this episode, it's going to go from worst to best. So when you take a look at the 9th ranking for overall on the season for Chicago, it means the 9th most fantasy points. However, when you take a look at what they've done against opposing quarterbacks over the last several weeks, they have been ranked 21st against opposing quarterbacks in fantasy points against. They've played much better. Should we be worried? Now, I don't imagine many of you are going to be starting Shedeur Sanders this week. If you are, it's probably a 2-quarterback or a super flex league. If you find yourself starting him this week in a 1-quarterback league, you probably have run into a few injuries. But Jordan Love and Brock Purdy will absolutely be on the radar for a ton of fantasy teams in the fantasy playoffs. So what can we expect? Well, over the course of the last 4 games, they've already faced one of these quarterbacks, and it's Jordan Love. And he's really the only one that's had a ton of success against them over the last 4 games. For the last game against Chicago, he threw for 234 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. But the other performances were Jalen Hurts, who was 19 of 34 for 230 yards, 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Mason Rudolph was 24 of 31 for 171, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. And then J.J. McCarthy, 16 of 32 for 150 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. So yeah, that 21st against the pass over the last 4 weeks is lying to us a little bit. I think the Chicago Bears are much closer to the 9th ranking that we've seen them have for a majority of the year. One of the biggest reasons why they've been a lot better against opposing quarterbacks as of recent is because of Mason Rudolph and J.J. McCarthy. A couple of guys that you haven't really expected them to light up the scoreboard this season anyway. Jalen Hurts, he wasn't awful. He threw a couple of touchdowns and 230 yards. And then, of course, Jordan Love was very good against this Bears defense. So when you take a look at needing to start Jordan Love or Brock Purdy, both of these guys should be just fine, because right now the current numbers show the Bears are more of a myth. Also at the quarterback position, another team that's been inside the top 10 of most fantasy points allowed to the position this year, the Jacksonville Jags. But over the last 4 weeks, they're ranked 27th in terms of most fantasy points against the quarterback position. They've been playing much better. Now, their upcoming schedule doesn't have a ton of guys that we're probably worried about in the fantasy playoffs. Brady Cook this week for the New York Jets? No, nobody's starting Brady Cook. However, next week against Bo Nix, that's going to be a big one. And there are some sickos out there who've been picking up Phillip Rivers and plan to try and play him as well, especially in Superflex and 2-quarterback leagues. So if you have to play Bo Nix, if you have to play Phillip Rivers, what are you going to be getting against the Jags? I will say this. Some of the success the Jags have had over the last 4 weeks are directly tied to some of the quarterbacks that they have faced. Last week, Daniel Jones went down early, so they only had to play against Riley Leonard for a majority of that game. Now, before Jones left, he did throw an interception. So Jones and Leonard combined to throw for only 196 yards, no touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. And of course, had Daniel Jones played that entire game, it could have been a completely different outcome. The week before that, Cam Ward, he was held to under 150 passing yards, didn't throw any touchdowns, didn't have any interceptions either. Jacoby Brissett, now this is a guy that's been lighting up opposing defenses. He did throw for 319 yards, but they did a solid job of keeping him out of the end zone. Only 1 touchdown, didn't cause any turnovers. The week before that, was another issue in terms of having to face a backup quarterback. Justin Herbert played a majority of the game, but when he left, Trey Lance ended up coming in, and they didn't combine for a ton of production. They ended up going 13 of 26 for 93 yards. That's right, 93 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 1 interception. So yes, the Jags defense looks way better over the last 4 weeks than it has for the majority of the season. And even though they've been ranked 27th for the last 4 weeks, they're still inside the top 10. So that shows just how bad they were at the beginning of the year until the last few weeks. But you don't look at anybody here except for Jacoby Brissett and get really excited about what they've done as of recent, because it's been Riley Leonard, it's been Trey Lance, Justin Herbert for a little bit before that, it's been Cam Ward, a bunch of guys that, again, you don't expect them to put up huge fantasy numbers. So once the Jags go up against maybe Bo Nix, maybe Phillip Rivers, they're going to give up way more fantasy points than what we've seen as of recent. Let's move from quarterbacks to running backs, and there was really only one team to highlight when it came to teams that have been inside the top 10 most fantasy points allowed for the entire season, and that's the Dallas Cowboys, who right now are ranked 5th in terms of total fantasy points allowed to the running back position, but over the last 4 games they have been ranked 16th. And we know that they made some deals at the deadline, but they are the only team inside the top 10 right now that over the last 4 weeks has actually been significantly better. So, against the Dallas Cowboys, coming up, we have Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason this week with Minnesota. Then we have Omarion Hampton. He's going to be a big one. Even Chris Rodriguez, he's becoming a more popular streaming option over the last couple of weeks, and he's getting the majority of the work for Washington. So if you find yourself in a position where you're battling for a championship, is it going to be worth starting Chris Rodriguez? Let's take a look at just how good the Dallas Cowboys may or may not have been over the last 4 games. So here's the thing. If it weren't for the Detroit Lions last week on Thursday Night Football, the Cowboys actually would have a much better ranking over the last 4 games, but Detroit absolutely shredded the Cowboys on the ground. They ran for 103 yards on 18 carries and 4 touchdowns between Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, but they also added 8 targets, caught all 8 of them, for 90 yards. So that was a whole lot of fantasy points against this Cowboys team. They would have been outside the top 20 had it not been for that game. What other matchups did they have, though? Going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, Kareem Hunt, who's the main running back right now, he had 58 yards on 14 carries, didn't do anything in the passing game, and didn't find the end zone. Saquon Barkley, this is probably one of the bigger ones that we should be looking at. Now, we know he hasn't been all that good for a majority of the season. He does have a couple of bigger games, one including last week against the LA Chargers, who've been a solid defense this season. But against the Cowboys a few weeks ago, he only ran for 22 yards on 10 carries. He did add 52 receiving yards on 7 receptions, but realistically, when you look at Saquon Barkley and what some other teams have done, like the Lions last week, those numbers aren't all that bad. And then the week prior to that, Ashton Jeanty really didn't do anything with Las Vegas. He ran for 7 yards on 6 carries. He added 27 yards on 6 receptions. So for the 3 games prior to the Detroit Lions, they did a very good job at shutting down the run. With the exception of the Lions game, I think this defense that we're seeing from the Cowboys right now against the run is not a myth. I think they are much improved, and I would be willing to bet that a lot of people actually agree. You would be shocked what Quinnen Williams can do in the middle of that defense to help slow down the run. And they've improved at the linebacker position, and they're getting healthier on defense. And the Cowboys are one of the specific reasons why I decided to do a video like this, because there are a lot of defenses that, for whatever reason, have not performed all that well throughout the year. And now after the trade deadline, after players have gotten healthy, whatever it may be, they're a lot tougher to face. And for those of you out there who might just be checking out some numbers or looking at some fantasy stats that aren't really diving into the depths of what a defense has done recently, you might look at the Cowboys and own Omarion Hampton and think to yourself, oh yeah, this is an easy start. I'm running with Hampton. He could end up having a big week. When in reality, his upside is really a whole lot lower. And when you're in the fantasy playoffs and you're trying to construct your roster to make sure that you are meeting the matchup that you have coming at you that week, starting Omarion Hampton may happen regardless of the matchup, because he might be one of the better running backs you have. But the players you place around him could change if you are looking at it and you're saying, well, Omarion Hampton has a great matchup against the Cowboys. I can play it a whole lot safer because I know I could get a big game from him. When in reality, if it is a tougher matchup like what we've seen from the Cowboys as of recent, you might say to yourself, man, Omarion Hampton doesn't have nearly the upside I would like. I'm still going to play him, but I need to play some other high upside players around him to make up for the fact that maybe his upside isn't as high as I would like this week. Before we move on to the next position though, let me address the elephant in the room. All my Lions gear. And I just got to spend a couple of minutes hyping them up. They played very well against Dallas on Thursday Night Football. They've got a tough matchup this week against the LA Rams, so it might not be nearly as good as I would like it to be, but you can bet that I'm still going to be repping my Lions and my Chubbies polo. This is by far the most comfortable shirt in my closet. I rep it every Friday when I record, and on Sundays, Thursdays, whenever the Lions are playing, you can bet that you're going to find me in my Chubbies. And it's been a blast working with Chubbies this season. Helping them launch their new NFL line has been awesome. However, I think you need to go check out everything else they have to offer, because their NFL line is just a small portion of what you can get over at Chubbies. And with Christmas almost here, if you're looking for a gift for someone in your life and you have no idea what to get them, getting them something from Chubbies is absolutely guaranteed to be a hit. And when you check out over at Chubbies, make sure you use code HEADLINERS, because that's going to give you a $10 discount on your entire order. So head on over to Chubbies, check out everything that they have to offer, find a couple of gifts for those that you still need to shop for, use code HEADLINERS, and get $10 off. Let's talk about tight ends now. And there's a couple of defenses that have played way better against opposing tight ends than they did at the beginning of the season. And the first team we're going to talk about is a team we already discussed against quarterbacks, and that's the Jacksonville Jags. Because on the season right now, they have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. That's a lot of fantasy points. And if you have Tyler Warren in 3 weeks, you want to know whether or not you should be expecting that type of upside, or if it's more like the 18th ranking that they've had over the last 4 games. One of which was also against Tyler Warren. But in a couple of weeks, they are playing Evan Ingram too. And some of you out there might be looking for a tight end streamer. And if you look at Evan Ingram because of the matchup, you really need to know whether or not he actually has that type of upside. But over the last 4 games for the Jags, like I just mentioned, they faced Tyler Warren. They allowed 2 receptions on 6 targets for 15 yards. To defend Tyler Warren here, he did lose his starting quarterback. Before that was Chigo Okonkwo. He caught 4 of 5 targets for 29 yards. Trey McBride is really the only tight end that has had success against this team over the last 4 weeks. Prior to that, Oronde Gadsden, 5 targets, 2 receptions, 41 yards. And then Trey McBride, sandwiched in between these games, caught 9 of his 10 targets for 79 yards. But for a guy that's been scoring a ton of touchdowns, they kept him out of the end zone as well. The problem with this is that the one really good tight end they faced, they did give up quite a few fantasy points too. And then unfortunately, Tyler Warren, who's been a very good tight end all season long, he lost his quarterback. But is Phillip Rivers going to do any better? This is going to be a question that we're going to have to ask ourselves in a couple of weeks when these teams get back together. Because if Phillip Rivers comes out of retirement and actually plays well, then we might need to roll with Tyler Warren and feel really good about it. If Phillip Rivers comes out of retirement and doesn't play well, then Tyler Warren could be a problem. But even a guy like Oronde Gadsden was really, really hot. Coming into this game, he was definitely anticipated as being a much better opportunity going up against Jacksonville, and it didn't come to fruition. And since then, he hasn't been all that great either. So I think we have a lot of really big mixed results here. So I'm not going to lean towards this being a myth as of yet. The good news against Jacksonville, we're not playing Mason Taylor this week. We're probably not playing Evan Ingram next week. Tyler Warren is going to be the big question mark in 3 weeks. But we'll keep an eye on Phillip Rivers and see whether or not he can get the job done. And if he can, we will reassess at that time. The New England Patriots defense has been very good this season. The one position that they have struggled a little bit against has been the tight end position. Right now on the year, they are still ranked 9th in terms of most fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. But over their last 4 games, they are ranked 21st. That shows just how bad that they were at the beginning of the season, because being ranked 21st and still inside the top 9 means they've struggled quite a bit this year. And we definitely have some matchups to talk about here. The New England Patriots get Dalton Kincaid this week. In 2 weeks, they get the combination of Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, who's kind of come out of nowhere over the last couple of weeks. And another tight end that we're probably not going to start, but you never know, will be Mason Taylor in 3 weeks. So, Dalton Kincaid, Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, should we be looking at them? One thing to note, over the last 4 games, there is a bye because New England did not play last week. So let's take a look at the 4 games prior to the bye. 2 weeks ago, Theo Johnson had 29 receiving yards, 3 receptions on 8 targets. The week prior to that, Mike Gesicki caught 4 of 6 targets for 35 yards. And then 3 weeks ago, Mason Taylor, who they'll face again, 4 targets, 4 receptions for 30 yards. Now, when you take a look at what these teams have done over the last 4 games, the New England Patriots are technically only 3 games, because it's looking at the last 4 weeks and comparing those weeks. And if you have a bye, that's going to be taken into account, not the 4th game prior to that. But that's where things get a little bit more interesting, because Cade Otton, 5 weeks ago against this New England team, caught 9 of 12 targets for 82 yards. So, have things really turned around over the last few weeks? That's where things are complicated for the New England Patriots right now, because they did a really good job against Theo Johnson, but Theo Johnson has been up and down all season long. Mason Taylor, we've talked about it a lot on this channel. Whatever New York decided to do with him this season, it should be malpractice. The reason he's not more involved absolutely blows me away. Mike Gesicki hasn't done a whole lot of anything for the majority of the year. So at this point, that's not really that big of a deal. The last time they faced a tight end that was actually being utilized was Cade Otton, and that was a game in which he had 82 receiving yards. So for Dalton Kincaid, I'm good with Dalton Kincaid this week. I think he definitely has great touchdown potential. For Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, I think they've got a really good opportunity here as well. If I had to rank it, Isaiah Likely probably has more upside. Mark Andrews a little bit more touchdown dependent, but probably has a little bit of a better floor as well, because he's not going to be so reliant on a big play on potentially fewer targets. But that could get a little messy this weekend when we see how things play out in their Week 15 game. Mason Taylor in a few weeks, I'll go ahead and skip over on him. I think the Patriots defense right now over the last 4 games is a little bit more of a myth than anything. I think they are actually inside the top 10 of most fantasy points allowed, and probably still will be after these next couple of matchups. All right, now we're going to move on to the wide receiver position, and this is where we are going to get into the nitty-gritty of this video, because we have some big-time matchups and some big-time players going up against the 3 defenses that I'm going to highlight over the course of the next several minutes. These 3 defenses for the season are inside the top 10 most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. But over their last 4 games, they are ranked 18th or lower in most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And like I mentioned, we've got some big names, like the Pittsburgh Steelers, who we'll talk about first. Over the next few weeks, they've got Jalen Waddle this week, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams in 2 weeks. And then in 3 weeks, Jerry Jeudy, who is Shedeur Sanders, looks more like a fantasy option right now than he did at the beginning of the season. But are the Steelers better against the pass right now or worse? Now, some of this could change with TJ Watt over the weekend, because as of right now, he's in the hospital dealing with a lung issue. He's not expected to play this week, and if he doesn't play, the pass rush is not going to be nearly as good. So this 18th rank that we've seen from the Steelers over the last 4 games definitely may not be the Steelers defense if they don't have TJ Watt. But let's look at see who they faced over the last 4 weeks, because last week, Zay Flowers, who really hasn't done anything all season long, had 124 yards on 8 receptions and 11 targets. Rashad Bateman had 2 catches on 3 targets for 23 yards. The week before that, with the Buffalo Bills, Keon Coleman, 2 of 3 targets for 9 yards and a touchdown. Brandon Cooks caught his only target for 13 yards. I'm taking a look at the top 2 wide receivers from each of their last 4 matchups. DJ Moore had a huge day, 5 of 7, 64 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Rome Odunze caught 3 of his 9 targets for 53 yards. The week before that, T. Higgins caught 3 of his 8 targets for 63 yards and a touchdown. Jamar Chase, this is where things were really interesting because he only caught 3 of 10 targets for 30 yards. So it has been a mixed bag of results against the Pittsburgh Steelers over the last 4 weeks. But here is one thing that the trends are currently telling us. Are 2 wide receivers doing very well against the Pittsburgh Steelers? No, they're not. It's typically only 1 wide receiver. If you take a look at the numbers, Zay Flowers did really good, but the wide receiver 2 really didn't. DJ Moore did really good, but Rome Odunze didn't do a whole lot of anything. T. Higgins had a solid day, but Jamar Chase got held in check. They are taking away essentially 1 wide receiver, and they're allowing the other wide receiver to do more damage. So like Jalen Waddle could end up having a fantastic day, but whoever the wide receivers are after that may not get a whole lot done. Detroit's going to be interesting. Amon-Ra St. Brown could end up having a huge day, but Jameson Williams might not do anything. Jameson Williams could have a huge game, but Amon-Ra St. Brown may not. Jerry Jeudy. Maybe Jerry Jeudy has a big day, Cedric Tillman and everybody else does not. Maybe somebody else has a bigger day and Jerry Jeudy is held in check. So that's what we're getting with the Pittsburgh Steelers right now. 1 wide receiver, based on these past numbers, is likely to have a very solid fantasy day, while everyone behind them may not. And that's one of the reasons why their points have stayed a little bit lower as of recent, because they're not giving up a ton of points to all the wide receivers. They're only giving up a ton of points, really, to 1 of them. The Washington Commanders may end up being the most significant impact here in the fantasy playoffs when it comes to the wide receiver position. On the season, they have allowed the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But over their last 4 games, they are ranked 27th in most fantasy points allowed. That is in the bottom third of most fantasy points allowed. And if you're looking at that and thinking to yourself, man, I've got some concerns, we need to check on that, because Wan'Dale Robinson is this week. The week after that, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. The week after that, CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. For a majority of you in the fantasy playoffs, I'm going to be willing to bet that you have some sort of combination of these wide receivers. And you need to know if they're going to have a ton of upside against Washington, or if Washington actually is much improved. Let's take a look at what this team has done over their last 4 games. Against Minnesota, Jordan Addison caught 4 of 7 targets for 62 yards. Jalen Naylor, 3 of 3 targets for 30 yards. Nothing from Justin Jefferson. The week before that, Cortland Sutton caught 5 of 6 targets, 62 yards and a touchdown. Pat Bryant, 3 receptions for 42 yards. Now, like I mentioned earlier with the Patriots, over the last 4 games, Washington does have a bye. So the week before their Week 12 bye, they had Jalen Waddle, who caught 3 of 7 targets for 52 yards, while Malik Washington caught all 3 of his targets for 42 yards. But here's where the Detroit Lions make things interesting again, because this performance against the Detroit Lions is outside of the last 4 weeks of games. So it's not being factored into that 27th ranking. And when Detroit played Washington, Jameson Williams had 119 receiving yards with a touchdown on 6 receptions. Amon-Ra St. Brown also found the end zone on 58 yards and 5 receptions. Obviously, shutting down Justin Jefferson is great, but Justin Jefferson hasn't produced all season long. Not Justin Jefferson's fault, I'm not saying that, it's just true. Jordan Addison, Jalen Naylor really didn't do a whole lot of anything. Cortland Sutton, he's been really up and down this season. He had a solid day. Jalen Waddle actually was playing very, very well going into this game, and he really didn't do a whole lot of anything. So it does stand that the Washington Commanders are probably playing a little bit better as of recent than they were earlier in the year. It doesn't negate the fact, though, that they still have a very tough task in front of them. And Wan'Dale Robinson, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, George Pickens, CeeDee Lamb, All of those guys are above Jordan Addison, Jalen Naylor, Pat Bryant, Malik Washington. You could argue Wan'Dale Robinson and Cortland Sutton if you wanted to. You could argue Jamison Williams and Amon-Ra St. Brown with some of these guys. But still, those are some very good wide receivers that Washington has to try and shut down over the last few weeks of the season, and they haven't done a good job of that all year long. If it's me, I'm buying into that 27th ranking being more of a myth, and that they're not actually going to end up being there. But I do think they're better than 9th. So if I had to guess, they're probably going to be somewhere in the middle of the pack at the end of the season. But I'm still fine starting all of these guys. The Baltimore Ravens have a big matchup this week with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins if he's able to play. I'm recording this on Thursday night. It's going to come out on Saturday. So by the time I end up actually releasing this video, we may know for certain at that point whether or not T. Higgins is playing this week. So we're going to talk about some ifs and ands. Stephon Diggs, Kayshon Boutte in a couple of weeks. Both of those guys, we've been trying to play them at certain times in fantasy. Christian Watson, who's one of the hottest wide receivers in the league right now, has a tough matchup this week against Denver, but in 3 weeks in the fantasy championships, we're going to want to know is if the Ravens defense has been ranked 10th against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points, or the Ravens defense that over the last 4 weeks has been ranked 19th. Well, I'll tell you this. I definitely think they're closer to being inside the top 10 of most fantasy points allowed. Because over their last 4 games, they do have a couple of matchups where John Mechie, Adonai Mitchell, Jerry Jeudy, and Cedric Tillman were their biggest issues, right? Those aren't really guys that we're putting up against Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Stephon Diggs, even Christian Watson at this point. But even if you take a look at it, DK Metcalf last week, 7 receptions for 148 yards. Jamar Chase a couple of weeks ago, 110 receiving yards. John Mechie, he had 65 receiving yards and a touchdown against this defense. Not a great fantasy day, but still a solid fantasy day. Cedric Tillman had 52 receiving yards against them. So when you take a look, Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, Adonai Mitchell, John Mechie, because those aren't guys that you're expecting a ton of huge fantasy performances anyway, that's why that 19th ranking is way lower than 10th. The good wide receivers, Jamar Chase, DK Metcalf, continue to eat against this defense. And now they've got Jamar Chase and T. Higgins once again. They're going to have Stephon Diggs. They're going to have Christian Watson. If it's me and I'm playing against the Ravens, I'm definitely expecting way more fantasy points than what they've given up recently to opposing wide receivers. I am all on board with firing up these guys against the Ravens. And like I said, I still think they're going to be pretty far inside the top 10 of most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers by the time we finish up week 17. Headliner Nation, hopefully you appreciated this one-off video and hopefully it helped answer some questions about some fantasy relevant players that you're going to be taking a look at over the next several weeks and some impending matchups that on paper as of recent don't look nearly as good as maybe they would have earlier in the season. But hopefully we calm some fears. Hopefully we helped answer some questions. But hopefully you hit the like button down below. It's free, it's easy to do. It's the easiest way to help support the channel. It doesn't cost a dime. But leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Become a member if you want to today. Find out some of that awesome insider content that you can only get access to if you are a member. But more importantly, the holidays are right around the season. So stay safe and stay healthy. And I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics, off the chain, challenge.